of Ireland. An opportunity to give a talk to St. Patrick is not something that comes around every year. Might only happen once in my life, so I'm going to enjoy it, so thanks Jim. And I'd like to thank Dan and the Hudson Valley Irish Festival Committee for inviting me to come over and talk a little bit, and I'll only be able to talk a little bit, I guess, today, and give you guys maybe a little bit of a flavour of what's in the book. Listening to some of the writers here, I think I probably pale in comparison to some of the abilities you guys have as writers, but hopefully what I lack in experience, I'll make up for the youthful exuberance with this being my first book. Okay, so, and just one last special mention to somebody who's helped me a lot through this process, Dr. Ron O'Donnell, who did speak here a couple of years ago, and is a great friend of Dan and Jim and the AOH. So I'll talk a little bit, I guess, before I talk about the book, a little bit about me, how I got involved in the research that I got involved in, and I guess what brought me to here today. So starting off, I didn't learn a whole lot about Irish history in school. Very little about 20th century Irish history. So very much my interest in Ireland, Irish America, the Irish American community has been very organic. So I started off, I took a class in university about what happened in Northern Ireland, and a little bit of background about what happened during the Troubles. Because we don't learn it in the south of Ireland, we don't learn about what happened up north in school. So it wasn't until university, and I took a class, and I became very interested in particular events that happened, two which I'll talk about because they're covered in the book. And it kind of happened from there. So then I wrote a project on Bloody Sunday in Derry, which again I'll talk about which happened in January 1972. And then in the classic Irish sense, I met my PhD supervisor, Ruan, over a beer in a pub, accidentally one night. I walked in, he was sitting there, and we got to talking, talked a little bit about what I had done, what I was interested in. He said, why don't you do a PhD? And that sounded crazy to me. Growing up, I thought only scientists got PhDs, so and from there it just happened organically. And I started to get really interested in Irish Northern Aid, or NORAID. I guess because, first of all, the depiction in Ireland of Irish Americans is St. Patrick's Day, it's Guinness, it's shamrocks, that type of thing. And I wanted to know if there was something more to it. And I think from researching the book, it's obvious that it was. But to start off, so the way the book starts, so what I tried to do with the book is focus on key events that are happening in Ireland, and then some of the key individuals that are here in America who are, I guess, staying actively involved and campaigning with what's happening. So just a little background before we launch into. So the book starts by talking a little bit about the tradition of Irish America, which, as I said, some of you in the audience, and I'm sure any Hibernians that are in the audience will be very familiar with some of the connections between Ireland and America, beginning in the late 18th century with the 1798 rebellion, Wolfe Tone, the United Irishmen, and them coming over to America. The mass migration that happened in the aftermath of An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, which brought over 1.5 million Irish immigrants to these shores, and a lot of them obviously settled on the East Coast in places like here. And then obviously you had the formation of Clan na Gael in the 1860s, 1867, an Irish American fraternal organisation who still exists to this day, and have played a somewhat behind the scenes role, but certainly a role in shaping Irish America and the Irish American community. And some of you who are in the audience, Irish America has always played a key role in a lot of the events that happen in Ireland. It's why, for example, 10 times as many people in America identify as Irish than the population of the island of Ireland. So something has to have happened there. But key Irish events, 1916 Easter Rising, of course we had the centenary of that just a couple of years ago in 2016. The War of Independence in the early 1920s, and also the Irish Civil War, which is currently being commemorated, although very low key, in Ireland, and also I see that Hibernians and other organisations are having events to commemorate the centenary of that tragic war here as well. And that migration kind of forms the introduction to the book. in terms of the fact that in the aftermath of the Irish Civil War, we had thousands of Irish men and Irish women who had fought on the anti-treaty side, so against the Anglo-Irish Treaty, who had come over to the United States and had kept up their interest in what was happening in Ireland and became involved in key organisations. The GAA still plays a key role with Gaelic Park, obviously, and also Clan Gael. So obviously I'm skipping ahead a little bit, I can't give you everything that's in the book, but we move on to talking a little bit about the formation of Irish Northern Aid, or NORAID, after the split in the Republican movement in Ireland in 1969. Again, it goes into a little bit in the book, so I won't go over too much, but in early 1970, and one of the key figures involved in that is a man, Mike Flannery, who lived, I believe, in Jackson Heights in New York, with his wife Pearl, and lots of other figures. I'm leaving so many people out when I talk about this, but a lot of the obviously founding members of NORAID, born in Ireland, coming over to the United States, a very, I guess, atypical story for so many in the early part of the 20th century and beyond that, in coming over to America. And talking about a little bit about some of the early events that played a huge role, I think, in the conflict itself, and also in the kind of growth of the ancient Hibernians and the Irish Northern Aid. You had the introduction of internment or imprisonment without trial in August 1971 in Ireland, which affected exclusively the nationalist Catholic community. And that was a big turning point in the conflict itself, and also in America. Suddenly people started to notice, I think, on these shores a little bit about what was happening in Ireland. Certainly they would have had some passing interest, I guess, in what was happening in the motherland, but suddenly they started to see images being transmitted across of people being beaten on the streets, protest marches, and the like. And I think probably the biggest event, which I mentioned earlier, that sparked interest in Irish America was Bloody Sunday. Now, I know that there was a Hibernian tour that went to Ireland last April that visited Derry. I visited Derry myself only a couple of weeks ago with a group of students from Syracuse University, actually, and you can still see the impact that's having today in Derry. It's 50 years later, the anniversary, the centenary was in January. So these are very real events that are still having huge impacts on those communities to the present day. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it might be history and it might have happened 50 years ago, but it's still very much affecting these communities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But what that event did do in America, it seems, and I touched a lot about it in the book, is it allowed organisations like NORAID, who had supported the Republican movement and the right to defend the communities, the opportunity to raise more money, to gain more members, and also to create a publicity campaign. And I'm sure some here will be familiar with the Irish People newspaper that was published out of an office in New York City. And that was set up in the aftermath in the summer of 1972. And you also had larger socials, which I'm sure, as I said, some people here would have attended, maybe not 50 years ago, but certainly in the interim. Okay, so very much the book tries to focus on some of those key events. So as I said, I am leaving a lot of, you have to, with one book, leave out some of the developments, but certainly try to focus on key events such as the aftermath of Bloody Sunday in Derry. The next event, or the next chapter in the book, focuses on the hunger strikes in 1981. Again, 40-year anniversary of that, I think, was celebrated here, or I don't celebrate is the right word, here in America last year. Actually, I would say that probably the commemorations in Irish America were much greater than the commemorations that took place across the island of Ireland, with the exception of a couple of key counties in the north. So we had a prison protest. We had political prisoners, political prisoner status in Ireland, in the north. That started with Kieran Nugent, who I believe came on tour to the United States in the late 1970s. And we had hunger strikes. That's what culminated the prison protest. And as anybody who was alive during that time, either in America or the United States or across the world, would have seen or heard of the 1981 hunger strikes, the impact that they had in Ireland, in America, with Bobby Sands and 9 others who died in hunger strike. But importantly, what I tried to do in the book was talk about the key figures, people like Martin, who's in the audience, and others who tried to publicise that the conflict in Ireland, what was happening in Ireland, to an American audience. Did key things such as bring over relatives of hunger strikers to speak, had a publicity campaign, protests at the British consulate, and just generally trying to make people aware, I guess, of what was actually happening in Ireland. And it's crazy to think that how recent so many of these events were. But just trying to keep people aware of what was happening. And because there was a general visa denial and censorship in Ireland, for example, what happened was that a lot of people just didn't know what was happening in Ireland. Didn't realise, like I remember talking to my parents, being from Limerick myself, and saying that Derry and Belfast as cities might as well have been the other side of the world. It was nothing compared to what they experienced growing up in the 80s. Not that the south of Ireland was particularly prosperous, there was huge immigration to America and other places of Britain in the 1980s. But I remember even growing up as a young person in the 90s, thinking that Derry and Belfast, that they might as well have been on the other side of the world, because I didn't grow up with that experience of experiencing cities. So just trying to publicise, I guess, what was happening to an American audience was kind of one of the themes I tried to focus on the book. Now, particularly with the Irish People newspaper, which thankfully was digitised a couple of years ago. So I'd recommend anybody, and I'd be happy to share a link to have a look at that. You have a look, you might see names, possibly of relatives, and some of the events that were happening in America during this time period. They have it all digitised online, it's great. But one thing I thought was really interesting was that the Irish People newspaper itself had to go through a campaign against the United States Department of Justice, who wanted effectively to shut down the newspaper. And I remember reading a quote in the British archives that described it as creative harassment. In other words, to try and get at NORAID in any way that they possibly could. And that was kind of one of the themes I touched on in the book, was how much the British government particularly are talking about NORAID all the time, whilst also dismissing Irish Americans as misguided and ignorant about what was happening in Ireland, but are also trying to undermine and disprove all of the things that they're saying, which I think is interesting. Some of the other things that are discussed in the book, we touch on the tours of Irish Americans that was organised, I think, in 1983, a joint effort by Sinn Féin and NORAID that talked about bringing a group of Americans who, I guess, had no real concept of what it was like in Northern Ireland, growing up, living there every day, who wanted to go and experience it firsthand for themselves. So I think the first tour was 1983, they did several others in 84, 85. And one thing that I got from talking to some people who were on those tours was it really brought home, and it really was an eye-opener to what it was actually like living every day, because sometimes we glamorise war, we look at conflict, but to actually see the impact of it, I think I really resonated with a lot of Irish Americans, and it was a really interesting time, I think, and that's touched on in the book, particularly the incident in 1984, which led to the death of Sean Downs, a 22-year-old young man who was killed with a plastic bullet. So that incident is discussed in the book. Some of the other things I think that are still relevant, I would say, to the present day, were the McBride Principles campaign, named after Sean McBride, who won a Nobel Peace Prize after serving in the IRA, interestingly. And that became kind of the flagship issue in Irish America in the 1980s. It was still ongoing. I'm sure some people here are familiar with it, or even involved in the campaigns. That became an important issue in the 1980s, touched on that, particularly in New York, actually, where the Deary-Flynn bill was the first kind of starting of it, and then eventually was signed into law. And I talk a little bit in the book about the campaign in New York and how interesting it was that British and Irish government officials rallied against the principles, even though all they were calling for was improved employment standards for the Catholic population in Northern Ireland. So it was viewed as a fairly innocuous enough changes, but was rallied against so hard, particularly in this state. And also wanted to mention the Irish American presidential forums, where native New Yorker John Deary was heavily involved in organising the first one in 1984. And they became an important kind of vehicle and opportunity for the Irish American community to kind of lobby presidential candidates, and something that I know the Irish American community is very eager and active involved in now, with lobbying political candidates for Irish issues. And at the time, issues such as the Joe Doherty case, visa denial, immigration issues, special envoy, which is something that I know the Hibernians and other organisations are keen for the current president to get involved in as it relates to Northern Ireland. So all very, very topical issues and relevant issues for the present day, and I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the 1992 iteration of it with Bill Clinton and Jerry Brown, which is broadcast on C-SPAN. I recommend anybody watching it if they're interested. In which Clinton made some promises in his campaign that night in the Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, that he actually ended up, and lots of presidential candidates make promises during their candidacy that they don't necessarily follow through on, but it probably became the foreign policy legacy, I would say, of the Clinton presidency, whether you liked it or didn't like it. It probably became the defining issue of his presidency, his involvement in the peace process and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And as I said, the links to NORAID are there with the editor of the Irish People, Martin Galvin, on the podium. You had former AOH President Jack Irwin as moderator, so you had the Hibernian links there. But again, an important issue that I wanted to touch on in the book, because maybe something that's a little bit forgotten about, but was certainly a key event and lobbying efforts in the late 80s, early 90s. So just to kind of conclude, I don't want to take up too much time. So what I tried to touch on with the book is I wanted to write about an organisation like NORAID, because ultimately they raised millions of dollars that went to the families of Republican prisoners. They created a publicity campaign that helped to shape the Irish American community's opinion at the time of what was happening in Northern Ireland and in Ireland more generally. And what I'm always very keen to point out with this is that they're an organisation, whether people agreed with their views or didn't, that are worthy of academic examination. And that's what I tried to do in the book. I was very surprised when I started this process that no book had ever been done on an organisation that is talked about and has such a name recognition across the United States and also in Ireland and the UK. So I guess I'm open to criticism. I was the first one to do it. But one of the major themes I wanted to touch on when I did the book is how important and the connections were between Ireland and America, and how reactionary Irish America always was to events that were happening in Ireland, which I touched on, as I said, in the book with Bloody Sunday and the 1981 hunger strikes. And also that, sadly, with a book like this, there are probably some people that I am sure that I've left out that deserve more credit, and I've probably possibly given credit to people who other people would argue don't deserve as much as they got. But it's very much as a starting point for me, with my research and just with research more generally. My hope kind of is that we start to look, as we're now over 20 years, 25th anniversary this year of the Good Friday Agreement, we're starting to move away from the conflict in Northern Ireland, that we can now start looking a little bit more objectively at the conflict, at the role of different actors, such as organisations like NORAID and Irish America more generally, and also that dialogue can start to happen, I think. And one thing with a book like this is that it's still all very relevant today with the current issues that are happening and the relationship between Irish America and Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit, in the context of the exit from the European Union, and with the recent, I think it was just this week, results in the most recent census. So, and the conversations over Irish unity. So, thanks for listening. I'm open to talking about, anybody who wants to ask any questions about the book. I'll be here for a while and happy to talk about it. I hope that this book will do some justice, I guess, to some of the people who were involved in Irish Northern Aid, involved in organisations like the AOH, and that, as I said, it's very much a starting point for me on the journey, and that anybody who gets a copy of the book or gets a chance to read it, hopefully you enjoy it. So thanks guys for listening, thanks for having me.